We only have just under 170 commercial airports in Brazil. So if you get the flight volume, so for example, in the United States, on a typical day, you have between 45 to 50,000 domestic flights a day. In Brazil, it's 1,500. Brazil is so complicated that just because something happened in the past and it worked, there was some sort of pattern, the pattern is not going to be repeatable.
Hello and welcome to Brazil is Not for Beginners. Today, our guest is Phillip Klien. Phillip, or PK as he goes by, is the CEO of ClickBus, the largest marketplace for bus ticketing in Brazil. PK, thanks so much for joining us. Really excited.
Isaac, thank you for the invite. It's great to be here.
Yeah, this is a topic that I'm really interested in. We've talked about it before. I think anybody that's come to Brazil has seen the number of buses on the streets and on the highways in particular. And so something that I'm just curious about as somebody that rides around here and travels. And so really excited to hear about that. Before we get into buses, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So first of all, I have this American name, but I was born and raised in Brazil. My mom was American, is American still. My father is Brazilian. They met in college in Colorado State, got married, and my mom moved to Brazil in the 70s. And yeah, I like to say that allows me a very unique perspective, almost like an anthropological perspective of being able to see Brazilians in the wild, but at the same time, really being a Brazilian. And I love this place. I like to say I love this mess. I mean, I did my undergraduate in the U.S., but the day after I graduated, I was already here in Brazil. I've been lived here,
Amazing.
my professional life here as well, too.
Great. And on that note about your background, so you're at ClickBus now, but you've had a couple of really cool positions beforehand. And I think that relates a little bit to your, shall we say, mixed parentage. So maybe actually before we get into the things that you've done and the work that you've done, I like how you always called it translation work. Can you talk a little bit about that anthropological perspective that you have? So you said you have mixed parentage with an American mom. What was it like growing up in Brazil and going back and forth, especially in the 80s and 90s when there was, can we say, tumultuous times with inflation and democracy starting here in Brazil, the end of the dictatorship? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that tumultuous times in Brazil is a constant, right? It always happens. So, I mean, American educated. I did the American high school. I'm from Rio de Janeiro originally. I've been living in São Paulo now for 15 years. And when I lived in the U.S. doing my undergrad, I had the opportunity of not having international friends. Actually, most of my friends were local. So it gave me a very unique perspective on how Americans think. And I have a U.S. family, all spread out the U.S. there as well, too. And I like to say that, Isaac, Brazil is always an adventure at any time. And you have to think, my U.S. family, my U.S. grandmother is a middle school, public school math teacher in Boulder, Colorado. And my grandfather was an architect. So my grandmother was really surprised that my mom used to ride in an armored car in Rio de Janeiro, right? And for Brazilians,
That's culture shock.
Yeah, that's kind of pretty normal. I mean, if you have a mid to higher end car, you usually have it armored. And even the word armored is very aggressive. And I never managed to really explain that was just normal. So, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting the gap. And I think it was much bigger when you were in the 80s and the 90s because of the lack of communication, internet, and what have you.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think right now with the internet and social media, and Brazilians are very online people. They like to try new technologies, which I think is going to be something that we can talk about a little bit in the context of ClickBus. But before, things used to delay in getting here. So I think everything was always kind of 5 years late, 6 years late. And so
it still is. I mean, a lot of the experience I've had in some of the U.S. companies here in Brazil, we definitely emulate, or we can see the future in other geographies, which is going to hit here eventually as well.
can you talk a little bit about that? So before we get to ClickBus, you said you worked for some of these American companies. So you have a really interesting background, and I'd love for you to go a little bit more into that.
Sure. So I come from a family of entrepreneurs. My grandfather immigrated from Germany to Brazil. My grandmother was from Austria. They each had started their own companies. My father started his own company. So that was going to be my next step here as well as the oldest kid in my family. And I started a company, and this was back in the late 90s, but it was a digital company. So I can say that I am one of the oldest executives in Brazil that has only worked at digital companies.
Amazing.
The company was named Predicta. It was a marketing technology platform. We had ad serving and web analytics solutions. And I spent 13 years of my professional life as an entrepreneur. We eventually sold that company to RBS Group, which is Brazil's second largest media group. Initially, they did an investment in 2011, and then they bought the totality of the company in 2013. And then I started the executive part of my professional life. I started at Twitter. I was director of growth in 2015. Again, this was a time that Twitter was starting to reach some challenges of growing in the United States, and their thesis was that growth was going to come from strategic international markets. I spent a year at Twitter, and then I was very interesting because I reported directly to San Francisco.
Very cool.
So that was my first experience of asynchronous slash remote work way pre-pandemic times. And then I went for Uber. This was in 2016. Uber had 2 years in Brazil. They were growing like crazy. It was the company to work for. And the role was to be general manager for Uber's largest region, which was São Paulo State. This was before IPO and where Uber had a very decentralized operational structure. And I like to say that those 2 years were my MBA that I never did.
Yeah, I'm sure.
After Uber, I went to OLX, which is Brazil's biggest classified platform. You can get a metaphor such as the Craigslist for Brazil. Spent 3 years there. Very interesting experience because it was much more startup-y. I mean, Uber, I think, had 11,000 people when I left. OLX in Brazil had 400.
Different environment, for sure.
Exactly. But at the same time, it was a very international company because OLX Brazil was a joint venture of the two biggest classified companies in the world. One was Schibsted, which is the biggest media company in Norway. And the other one was Naspers, right? Which everyone knows Naspers.
Okay.
So again, it really did give me an opportunity to report in board meetings of how do we grow Brazil to international professionals.
Yeah.
Then I did a quick stint at PicPay, and now I'm here at ClickBus for just about 3.5 years as well too. So yeah, I mean, working for, especially in my experience back at Twitter, I never know if you call it X or Twitter. I'm going to keep calling it Twitter because
Me too.
when I worked, that was what it was called. And Uber. So again, a lot of interactions with the Americans, trying to translate what happens in Brazil, bringing context, and at the same time requesting specific features, specific marketing campaigns, specific necessities that were unique to Brazil.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I want to get into that translation work. We always have great conversations about that. But now you're at ClickBus. You've been there for a little while. And as I mentioned at the top of the episode, I find the transportation industry fascinating. Like I said, I think it strikes everybody that gets here, the number of buses, the lack of trains, and how important buses are for inter and intra-city travel. So I was wondering if you could talk just high level, not necessarily about ClickBus, but just the Brazilian transportation industry and travel industry and kind of how that evolved. Why are buses so popular in Brazil?
Sure. So when you get Brazil, which is just the size of our countries, bigger than continental United States, and we have no railways. Railroad transportation just doesn't exist. And our air travel transportation is also very restricted. We only have just under 170 commercial airports in Brazil.
I didn't know that.
So if you get the flight volume, so for example, in the United States, on a typical day, you have between 45,000 to 50,000 domestic flights a day. In Brazil, it's 1,500. So it's about 30 times bigger, the domestic flight market in the U.S.
Yeah, factors.
And our highways are pretty decent. We can reach pretty much all of the corners of Brazil via our highways. Cars are very expensive. Gasoline is very expensive. So if you have to go somewhere, a lot of people use the bus. So we have 4,500 destinations out of the 5,500 municipalities in Brazil. So the capillarity is very high. And prices are very, very affordable. You're talking about between a fifth to sometimes even a tenth or a 20th of what it would cost to either rent a car if you don't have a car or air travel.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think the other thing about it, and you can talk as well, the bus, when you come from the United States, has a certain connotation. So we all rode those. I mean, at least I did, Greyhound buses in the early 90s, not the nicest place to be. And here, it's a completely different level. You go on some of these buses and they're all Wi-Fi enabled, especially when you're going on kind of medium haul or long haul. So you're going between big cities. They're really comfortable. You have the layback flat buses to sleep on for longer trips. And so it's a different type of experience. And I don't know if there's anything you could kind of share about that.
Totally, totally. I'm originally from Rio. My wife is from Rio, so we have family in Rio. We live in São Paulo, so we're talking about a 450 to a 500 kilometers, so about a 300-mile distance. And it's a 1-hour flight, or it's about a six and a half hour bus ride, or a 5-hour drive. And I say, typically, it takes much less time to go on the airplane, and that's not necessarily always true.
No.
With all the delays and the security necessities nowadays. But you will always, one, go cheaper on a bus, and two, more comfortable. The buses nowadays that transport, especially Rio, São Paulo, I mean, they're amazing. The seats, they are 180-degree reclines. They give you a pillow and a cover when you arrive. It's like the best first class you can get on any international travel.
Yeah.
And the buses are very comfortable, very new. The legislation in Brazil is very strict, so they only allow for very new buses to operate. And last but not least, it's very safe. We have some of the safest statistics of bus travel, intermunicipal and interstate in the world. But yes, it's so comfortable, and you can spend the night on the bus. So sometimes you don't even have to pay for the hotel in case you have a very important meeting the next day, or you can travel during the day and get a lot of work done. So from a comfort perspective and convenience perspective, it definitely beats air travel.
Yeah, I know some people that have come down and, investors and folks that come to Brazil and they take it as a way to kind of see the countryside. They'll build in a couple stops. They'll go to Belo Horizonte on the way or something like that, which isn't really on the way. It's a triangle, so it's a different direction, but you can kind of take advantage of these connections that you can do on the buses. And again, the price point to see more of Brazil. I haven't done any like super long haul, but I think it would be interesting at some point to do it, especially when you have the lay flat seats and things like that. It's not so terrible.
And from a geographic perspective for jobs and for work, you have Rio, São Paulo, Belo Horizonte, Curitiba, and Porto Alegre. And most of these cities, the distance, at least from São Paulo, which is pretty central, you're talking about 300 to 500 miles. So it's definitely doable via bus. Of course, when you go to some cities more in the northeast or in the north, that's a much longer trip. Or even Brasilia. Brasilia is like an 8, 9 hour bus drive from Sao Paulo. It's definitely viable. It's an opportunity to use that specific model.
Yeah, no, I agree. And a great way if you're a tourist to kind of get around, which I think also. So, obviously it's how the mass population moves around, but is also very accessible, especially kind of when you're buying the nicer tickets to do that type of thing. But coming back to your experience, and I mean, it's a little bit less so at ClickBus now because it is a local company, but one of the themes that came across in the work that you did at Twitter or X and Uber in particular was that translation work. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. So again, this anthropological, I think you have that perspective anyway, but what were the types of things that you needed to focus on and translate when you were working with international companies coming to Brazil or helping Brazilians understand how international companies work, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's a two-way street, right, Isaac?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think I can generalize on some of the fascinating dimensions, but nothing like true stories. So I'll start off with a small anecdote, which is pretty funny. But a lot of the gringos, especially when I was visiting with Brazilians at the headquarters, they'd be saying like, why do the Brazilians brush their teeth at lunch? They bring their toothbrushes to the office and they brush their teeth. They thought that was just so weird. And it's just one of those weird habits we have here. So I'm just kidding. So I think that when we look structurally, what is different, and I'm going to focus on the US here because that's where I can have a baseline and a benchmark. Imagine it's more similar to Europe as well to the US than it is to Brazil. But let's do the US Brazil comparison.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One of the things I use as a metaphor, especially in new teams or when I'm trying to introduce Brazil, is just the expectations we have as Brazilians sometimes are much bigger than what you have, for example, in the United States. And nothing for me describes this better than putting gasoline in your car metaphor. So in the US, you're going to put gas in your car, you drive up to the gas station, you turn off your car, you open your door, you get out of the car, you open up the gas compartment, you get the gas nozzle, you stick it in, you put in your credit card, and you finish, you take out your credit card, you leave. In Brazil, what you do is you roll down your window and then you say what type of gasoline and how much you're going to pay, and then somebody's going to do that for you. So that service that is embedded in a lot of the interactions we have here, and again, I'm not going to get into the why that is today. There's a lot of historical, economic incentives that drive us to this,
Yeah.
but it's just that the expectations for Brazilians with regard to service are so much higher or so much embedded in the customer journey than it is in the United States. The US is DIY. You go to Home Depot, you buy your whatever you want to do in home maintenance, you do it yourself. Here in Brazil, you're going to discuss with friends who you're going to call to help you to do it with. So I think that that exemplifies a lot of the differences we have culturally. And I see that reflected sometimes in digital experiences where I've been focusing my work at. So when you talk about customer onboarding, especially in the beginning, we tend to over skew. And a lot of the services in Brazil that succeed, they have either extra steps or they have extra focus with regard to servicing, Isaac. So that's one of the dimensions I like to question, I like to see, and that is something that is very different than what we see up north.
Can you go a little bit deeper on that extra steps? I'm wondering if there's any examples that you can give, because I find that really interesting. And I liked the metaphor as well about the DIY culture. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything else that you can share there about that kind of extra steps in the customer onboarding experience.
So while I was back at Twitter, one of the challenges we had, or one of the metrics, the denominators we're trying to optimize for, was the onboarding process. We observed that if the people you were following had content which was very compatible with what you liked, that would increase your retention and usage as well too. And again, we're talking about just under 10 years ago. Nowadays, algorithms pretty much drive a lot of these experiences.
Yeah.
But back then, it was much more manual, the account recommendations you had on sign up. And one of our objectives here was to hyper local marketing. And we did some tests where we would, based on the location of that person, based on some other signals they sent us, we'd manually pre-select these accounts, or in other words, bypass the algorithm, and then actually have some other accounts which would actually start tweeting some specific content, which would make kind of like the service, like, hey, do this for me. Let's maybe bypass this step that I have to choose some of the accounts, or I have to select what I'm interested in. And then again, the flow back then was choosing what were the topics that you liked versus then more than the actual accounts. And we saw great results with that as well. So it was a way of trying to talk and understand and actually service the people into having that first aha moment at a much faster rate than the other Twitter users. It was very hard to scale, very hard to reproduce, but it was definitely a lot of insights could be taken there for the way the algorithm actually worked. So that's one that I saw that happening. Looking at the data, looking at the before and after, I was very impressed on what this type of customized servicing really worked here.
How did so the headquarters, for lack of a better word, so when you would talk to your counterparts back in the US and you would have to drive these things manually, or adoption was slower, or there were different, for lack of a better word, tropicalizations you had to do, how did they respond to this? Were they like, go ahead, PK, do what you need to do? Or why isn't this working in Brazil? It should be bigger. What were the reactions like?
So it's interesting here because I had two very extreme experiences. At Twitter, Brazil was not that significant when compared to other international markets. So we're talking about UK, France, Japan, where back then Japan Twitter was bigger than Facebook, specifically when you looked at the revenue generation because of a currency and other factors there as well too. So at Twitter, since I was not that high ranked, it took a lot more convincing. But that's one of the great things about these US digital companies is you bring data, right? I mean, if you show, here's my hypothesis, here's what I'm basing my hypothesis, here's a very quick and dirty test that I did, here's the lift that I brought, now I need to scale this. So Twitter was very good with that. And again, they were also very confident that, specific markets needed different characteristics as well too. So I don't know if people are going to remember this, but Twitter was launching one of their first curated services. And the first country they were going to use is the US. And then because of the servicing and of a lot of the data we brought to them, they realized that the product was Moments, right? That Moments would be a great release for Brazil as well too. So we managed to convince headquarters to bring the second launch of the curated, or in other words, where you had people actually working for Twitter, which is kind of controversial back then. And we did the second launch of the product here in Brazil. So bring the data. And the opposite, Isaac, is what happened at Uber. Because Uber was so big and the product market fit was so good, especially here in Sao Paulo, it was quite the contrary movement. A lot of the PMs and a lot of the squads would come to me requesting to have their product features being tested in Brazil because we had the volume that we could do the test very fast and very rapidly as well. But it was very hard, for example, to describe some of the characteristics, especially around safety. Safety was a big issue here in Brazil back in 2016 and 2017.
Yeah, always is.
And back then, you could basically create an account on Uber. You could put Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, or what have you, and then you could start writing. There was no document validation, and that brought a lot of challenges that didn't impact so much other geographies as much as it did in Brazil. So we had to convince the product team to be able to do, for example, we have the CPF validations, which is kind of like the social security number for Brazil, which is called the CPF, the Cadastro de Pessoa Física. And Brazil, if I'm not mistaken, was the first geography that actually rolled out an individualized verification system for riders in the world.
Very interesting. Really cool. Another expression that you've used or that's come up when you and I chat is sometimes you'll say TIB for this is Brazil. So I want to go deeper on some of the things you mentioned there, but on this idea of this translation, what does that mean to you? Why do you use it? Or I don't know if there's some stories behind TIB.
Sure. So this is a reference to a movie I really like called Blood Diamonds. I
Yeah.
think DiCaprio was the main actor there. Controversial movie, but it's entertaining nevertheless.
Yes.
And Leo has a couple of times during the movie mentions to some other one, like TIA, this is Africa, where everything is different here. Things work out differently. And I think that resonated a lot with me as well, too. And it's a good way to communicate, like, hey, this is Brazil. Things work differently here. So I'll give you a couple of examples of like, what does that mean it works differently here? First of all, I think that Brazil is much more complex. So even with laws, legislation, there are some laws that the law is published, it's supposed to be enforced, but nobody follows the law and there's no punishment for specific laws. And
Sure.
the weird thing is, Isaac, if you've seen this firsthand, is that there is no pattern. There is no strict law of like, is this law going to work? Is this law not going to work? And this can sound funny for Americans, but the amount of laws enacted in Brazil is crazy. I don't have any specific metric, but I'm pretty sure we can chat GPT this and see this. But a good example that I use is Brazil implemented a law to reduce drunk driving. So I applaud this. I think this was great.
Lei seca.
And lei seca, exactly, which means like the dry law. And basically what they do is, especially in Rio de Janeiro, it's not as common in Sao Paulo, where they put police cars in big important highways or big streets to actually stop people and measure their alcohol content, even if there was no suspicious driving, which is kind of unheard of in the US, right? Why are you going to stop someone if there's nothing wrong? Here it's just very common. That actually changed behavior. I remember back when I was at Uber, even back when I was at Twitter, where we'd monitor the hashtags for this lei seca, right, the dry law.
Sure.
Or back at Uber, where we would see specific spikes in car riding during specific times in specific regions because of this. And I remember back then, between my Brazilian friends, like, oh, that's a law that actually pegou. That's a law that actually worked. And it was arbitrary on that thing. So what I like to say here is that Brazil is so complicated that just because something happened in the past and it worked, there was some sort of pattern, the pattern is not going to be repeatable. And there are a lot of examples like, hey, this something worked in the past, but all of a sudden everything is going to change in the future.
Yeah, I think it's one of these places that just when you feel like you have it figured out, they change the rules, right? So you got to stay on your toes and it's always moving. And yeah, you brought up the lei seca. I think I remember there being some Twitter accounts that would help you navigate where those blitzes were.
There was a hashtag, VOLS.
Okay.
It drove a lot of traffic, actually.
So it's nice to know that the Brazilians are creative in how they use these platforms. You mentioned the use of data in kind of communicating with American firms. So you'd say, well, what's great about digital firms or the startup-y firms, you bring them data and they will listen to it. And I'm wondering, what are some of the other differences you see working now for Brazilian companies and in a more Brazilian culture than in an American or an international company where it's got more of that international culture?
Sure. So let's get some significant trends or behaviors where you can bring statistical significance to show different responses in the geographies. And I think there are two really good examples here. The first example that I saw it working at international companies, and I'll bring the Europeans here as well too, back when I was at OLX, was just that Brazilians tend to have a very positive attitude, a very positive outlook towards life in general. So the ENPS, the Employee Net Promoter Score, always, and this is Brazil especially, but also Latin countries. The ENPS of Brazil was always 10, 20, 30 points above the company mean. And this was at Uber, at Twitter, at OLX, or what have you. So just the Brazilians in general, they're more positive about it. They're happier about it. Or maybe they have less expectations if you want to be a little more cynical here as well, too. So whenever you talk to Brazilians, and the ENPS was something that we measured internally, we had baselines, but just in general, when you do surveys, you have to consider it differently. I was listening to a podcast with Sean Ellis, which is considered the god of product-driven growth, right? PLG.
Okay. Yep.
And he was on a very famous podcast by Lenny, and he was mentioning that a specific case in Brazil about, he has one test, which he does for all products, is he asks, how would you feel if you could no longer use a product? And based on the threshold of the percent of people that said that they would be very disappointed, he would define if that product's worth going or not.
I like that test.
And he said that for Brazil, this metric was different. All around the world, it's 40%. But in Brazil, it's 50% because people are so positive about that. So I was like,
really interesting.
Whoa, all of a sudden you have this universal figure, and in Brazil, it's different. And we're working with GPTW, great place to work here at ClickBus. We're trying to get ClickBus certified here as well too.
Very cool.
And we just went through the survey process here. And it's funny because they use a slightly variation of the Likert scale, like, highly disagree to highly agree, which is always true to not always true. And the Brazilian scale, you start off with nunca é verdade, which is never is true. And then it goes all the way to sempre é verdade, always is true.
Okay.
But the American and the English version is almost always not true to almost always true. So the American or the English version has the almost on the extreme sides of the scale. And that's a big difference because if it's always true and you have one exception, it's not true.
Yeah.
But the Americans, they tolerate a slightly more lenient scale. And we reached out to GPTW asking, why is these scales different? And they said it's a cultural thing. So here you have more evidence of what's considered a global benchmark on understanding data, which uses different strategies or approaches when you're talking to Brazil or the US too. So those are 2 or 3 examples where you see, the cultural nuances where it's just, you can't just apply translation using ChatGPT to understand if your company is doing well or not, or how well your company is doing compared to other geographies because of these cultural nuances.
Really, really amazing stuff. I really love it. How does that factor in from like a managerial standpoint when you're thinking about these things, when you're thinking about managing these teams where people are more passionate, maybe is a good word? How have you managed it and how have you seen expats and gringos deal with it when you see these cultural differences?
So I used to love it because when we had some sort of a goal,
It was easier
a
for you to get
universal
there, huh?
company goal, I'm there. No, jokes aside. So I think this is a very data-driven question, right? I mean, this is one indicator. The absolute value is important, but you also have to see the trend. Is the trend
Of course.
positive? Is the trend negative? Do you break it down within Brazil? Is there a specific geography within Brazil or a specific department within Brazil that is kind of over under skewing? And you have to use different metrics as well too. So, and I love the NPS. I think it's an interesting metric to follow, but there are other aspects or dimensions that you really have to dive into, like retention rate and other metrics that you can collect to have a complete picture there as well too. And that's interesting, Isaac, is because some of these other metrics, they're not that different from the US.
Okay. Makes sense. And that's a really good segue to my next question. You and I have talked a lot about the importance of I think the term is psychological safety. So I know that it's something that's really important to you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I know we started out with transportation. We're heading more into management, but this is a fun conversation. And so can you talk a little bit about this concept of psychological safety and, where does it come from? Why do you find it important? And what's unique about it in the context of Brazil as opposed to, some of the other places where it maybe started out?
So, Isaac, this is a subject I'm recently fascinated by. I just read Amy Edmondson's book, Fearless Organization, and
Yep.
the evidence is there. Sometimes it's a little harder to measure, but just because you can't measure it doesn't mean it has significance. So I've been fascinated about this subject, reading a lot about it. We have implemented some metrics here at ClickBus as well to start gauging psychological safety. Yeah, so a little bit about the science behind this. This is something that's been studying for a couple of decades now. And basically, I think where this got the biggest spotlight was Google's Project Aristotle.
Okay.
Google did some research. Their people team, I think this was about 5 or 10 years ago, did some intensive research. I think it took almost 8 months, where basically they tried to understand what were the most important factors that generated success in a team.
Okay.
And they tried to isolate all of the different factors. I mean, is it how long the team worked together? Are they geographically close? Do they have similar backgrounds? Are they all high performers? And all the variables that they tried to correlate, there was one clear winner. And this was the biggest winner, which was psychological safety. So, I mean, psychological safety is not that you're going to guarantee that you're going to be working on this team forever, but it's about being able to vocalize your opinions in a safe environment,
Okay.
being able to give candid feedback. And in the study, it showed that independent of the team or the project or the objective, this factor was what brought the most success. And again, nowadays, when you talk about the increased participation of generative AI or AI in the workplace, remote or hybrid work is also becoming mainstream.
Yeah.
More and more, the work is about teams and less about individuals. And these teams are cross-functional, they are functional, they are permanent, they are temporary. So what is it that companies can do to better understand teams, better give managers tools so that they can increase psychological safety, which basically leads to better performance and increased innovation. And the second part of your question is, how is that different in Brazil and in the US?
Yeah, I was going to
So
come back to that part.
yeah, so I think that the American culture already brings a higher level of psychological safety, where the English language, the candidness, the way people work together, the way of being so objective facilitates a higher, at least basal level of psychological safety than what you have in Brazil. So I can give you some very good examples. Like we use in the United States, and look, I said we because I mentioned I brought myself as an American here,
Yeah,
active
it
voice,
can be both.
active voice. Isaac did this, Phillip did that. In Brazil, you say, oh, the project was done. They use the passive voice.
Yeah.
So there are already some nuances where it's like, hey, you want to kind of bring in some protection. I don't want to point out that my colleague did something here. The social aspect in the professional life in Brazil is so much bigger. So you kind of have these frictions that can generate a little bit less psychological safety, which could hinder the team in having this very candid communication.
Do you have any advice for, I mean, managers in general in Brazil, but particularly expatriate managers or people on regional teams that are dealing with Brazil to understand the Brazilian nuances, but still be able to encourage that psychological safety?
I'll start with a story here. So one of the things I'm very proud of back at the Growth Twitter team was that whenever we got on a call with any other international team, I mean, it was business, business, business. It wasn't like, hi, Isaac, how are you doing? What's going on? And, or how was your weekend? Oh, I heard you're going to go to the beach this weekend. That's going to be cool, whatever. And then Twitter always thought, I was like, no, so let's look here. So how is our MAU this month? Oh, okay, there's an increase here. And I was like, hey, guys, stop. We're working as a team here. We're already remote. We're 6 hour differences. Why don't you ask me how I'm doing? Or like, did you notice that I'm not that happy today? Look, let me tell you about this crazy story about how I almost got in a car accident this morning. So we created this new activity that we'd spend 120 seconds, that's 2 minutes, where one person would ask someone else about something personal.
I love it.
And that was a behavior we implemented into it, and that kind of changed the dynamic. So I don't have any playbook for international managers that are coming here or specific action items, but just pay a lot more attention. Maybe see what the other people are saying, see how people are interacting with each other. Being late in Brazil is different than being late in the US. The tolerance is much higher here. And instead of making it a negative aspect, bring the positive of it as well too. So I think that being a little softer, being a little more, not necessarily business is business, pleasure is pleasure, and being very observant will bring in some of the nuances that could generate more glue within the team.
I like it. I have read a lot of these different business books. You and I talk about it when we get together. What are we reading? We like each other's Goodreads pages. And I still want to know if you got that book or if it's still in the mail, the one from 3 months
I
ago.
did it. Can you believe it, Isaac? I ordered the physical copy because they didn't have a digital copy of it. And it's the second email that they're having trouble sending here as well, too, man. You're going to have to loan me yours.
I will get you a copy. It's my favorite nonfiction writer, Richard Kapuczynski. So a Polish writer I recommended to PK to read, but they haven't delivered it yet for him. But what I wanted to highlight was, we talk a lot about some of these different business books and this general concept of EQ and kind of developing these relationships with teams. And it's a little bit funny because there's obviously drawbacks to the work culture in Brazil and challenges that you have to overcome. But at the same time, you see a large emphasis in the US and leadership books around building EQ, around taking time at the beginning of a meeting to get to know your team, to create that psychological safety. And in some respects in Brazil, because of the informality, it's here, right? So I always like that Brazil is both a leader and a trailer at the same time in different ways. And so I think this one really ties into it. Are there any other management nuances, anything else that you've learned about managing teams in Brazil that you think would be helpful for other managers that are coming here? So both Brazilians that maybe, are listening in and just curious about what one and a half gringos think about Brazil, but also the regional managers, the executives that are coming to Brazil to manage teams. Any other advice for them or any other nuances that you'd highlight?
It's really based on authenticity and vulnerability. I think sometimes Americans will try to overcorrect. I mean, when you greet people here in Brazil, when it's female or male female, you actually give one kiss if you're in São Paulo on the cheek, or two kisses if you're in Rio on the cheek. And
Yes.
you never know how do you work with that nowadays in professional settings, especially post COVID. But I see that sometimes Americans will try to, no, this is what you do. I'm going to go, like, be authentic, mention it, talk about it. Like, hey, what do I do here? How am I going to work with it? So I think the spontaneity and the vulnerability of like, maybe, hey, I don't know what to do here, but can you help me out here as well too? Again, Brazilians love service, and if Brazilians love thinking, oh, let me show you how this works. But really, I don't think there's any playbook. I think is just realize that the social aspect is very important, that communication is different, that sometimes I get frustrated with lack of active voice communication where I don't know something, or sometimes people just avoid saying something because they're afraid of conflicts, and then
Yeah.
we actually educate here. We have it in our values here that constructive conflict is positive for the decision making, but that's not completely evident in how people in Brazil were growing up. There's more of a hierarchy here. There's more formality. A lot of my friends even talk to their father or mother, putting a sir or madam before. So just pay attention to the nuances. But at the same time, it's not that different, and people will respect for your authenticity here as well too. I don't know if you've seen this, but I don't think there's anything that you can really do wrong here. You're not going to be criticized, but oh my God, he didn't do that or she didn't do this. So I think it's just over skew for the social aspect.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I liked your comment about authenticity, but from a curiosity perspective, right? Ask if something works. You're a little bit forgiven as a foreigner, and Brazilians really appreciate when you show interest in the culture and interest in the language. And so that you're trying, that you're asking, that you're showing an interest in it, I think goes a long way, even if you get it wrong. I speak reasonably good Portuguese. Everybody says I speak much better Portuguese than I do. But I think more than anything, it's that I'm trying and that people appreciate that. And so I like that point about authenticity is if you don't know the answer, then ask. And I think Brazilians are more than happy to kind of show you the way.
I appreciate that. That's a very good compliment for us Brazilians. Thank you.
Absolutely. What does the expression Brazil is not for beginners mean to you?
I'm going to actually quote an American here, and actually quote a Brazilian talking about Americans so that then we can talk about Brazilians. So
Excellent.
an acquaintance, I wouldn't even consider him my friend. Once we were traveling in the U.S., I think it was during the winter. We were either Utah or Colorado. I don't remember specifically. And he knew that I had this very strong American side. And he's like, why are Americans so binary? It's either one or zero. And he gave me a whole bunch of examples. I'm not going to remember them now. It's like either this or that, or this or that, either this or that. And it was very frustrating for him. And I was like, that's a very interesting perspective, because Brazil is about 5,000 shades of gray. And I mean, to be exaggerating here, metaphorically speaking, rules are optional in Brazil. I don't want to sound like this is such a crazy place, but it is. And everybody can change it in an instant. So it's complicated.
Yes.
It's not good. It's not bad. It's complicated. So give me an example what you mean about, rules are optional. Red lights, right? Or a stop sign. A stop sign in the United States, you stop.
Yeah.
A stop sign here in Brazil means, if I get there before, I can go ahead. But red lights, you stop unless it's 2 a.m. And if it's 2 a.m., you don't stop in Brazil. Just like established. The law says you have to stop, but everybody knows and people will slow down because it's 2 a.m. And then not even getting into motorcycle delivery people because they don't stop at all. But I mean, that's a different aspect. But I think it's just complicated and it's less binary than what happens in the United States. And that could be a sign of less maturity.
Yeah, I mean, I like that idea of complexity, right? I don't necessarily think it's less maturity. I think it's just different culture and really great points. Can you share a Brazilian expression? You've already shared a couple of them, but is there a Brazilian expression or a Brazilian habit that really surprises foreigners? Or maybe when you're abroad and you do something and everybody's kind of like, PK, what are you doing? Something that you hadn't noticed before was a Brazilian habit.
Brush my teeth at lunch? No, I'm just kidding.
Yes, that too.
I think what I can use here as an example, and I'm going to be a little more specific about the carioca. Carioca is someone that's from Rio de Janeiro.
Yes.
And this is really amazing about Rio de Janeiro. I could speak hours about why I think that city is amazing. But on a sunny Sunday, everybody in Rio is going to be at the beach.
Yes.
And which is really good about the beach in Rio is that because you're at the beach, nobody knows what you're driving. You can't wear the fancy clothes. They don't know where you live. Everybody is so much more equal at the beach. And that's very positive. And that observation actually came from an English friend of mine too. He's like, I love it here at the beach because nobody knows who you are. Doesn't matter where you work at. It's just everybody's the same. And what happens at the beach is people are very open. And what you see is that you'll have like these softer relationships or acquaintances where you haven't seen someone in such a long time. And you'll be like, why don't you come over for lunch? You're like, okay, we'll come over for lunch. Yeah, sure. And that doesn't mean anything.
No.
If you go there for lunch, you're like, what the heck are you doing here? Oh, but you invited me to lunch at the beach. Oh, but that's like the beach language.
Yeah.
So the informality or trying to be much more of a friend, it's not necessarily negative, but it's just funny. It's like all of a sudden this person is my best friend. And it's not. It's not that it's not true, but at the same time, like take it with a little bit of grain of salt. Hold on a little bit. This is not my best friend here. We're not going to like be roommates the next day or two.
Yeah, that's one that took me a while to get because my first stint in Brazil, we lived in Rio and we would go out to the bars and you'd strike up conversation with some folks and you'd really hit it off and you'd be like, all right, we're friends. And then, you try to get the number from the person or you try to do something and like they're busy on the weekends. They've got their family. Like somebody else brought it up on a different podcast. Vamos marcar, right? Is like,
exactly.
let's schedule it. Exactly. And it doesn't mean anything. It's more see you around than actually let's get together. But PK, really great. I love our conversations. I really appreciate you coming on to chat. And this was more than anything, just one of our normal conversations that we recorded this time. How can people reach out to you? So, I know you advise startups on this translation type work. You're looking deeply into psychological safety. If people are interested in connecting with you, how should they do that?
Sure. So thank you, Isaac, as well for the opportunity. Brazil is not for beginners, but it's an amazing experience, an amazing place to work with.
Yeah.
There are challenges on its own. At the same time, it's very competitive. It's very challenging in a positive aspect as well, too, in problem solving. So that's what keeps me here. And I love this. And I hope to be an important agent in helping Brazil progress there as well, too.
I love it.
So I usually answer this question with my Twitter account, but unfortunately, we don't have Twitter in Brazil, at least not temporarily.
Yes.
But I'm actively on LinkedIn, P-K-L-I-E-N, I before the E.
Yes.
And as I mentioned, if you're into books, feel free to follow me or connect with me on Goodreads as well, too, P-K-L-I-E-N.
Yeah, you always have some good suggestions there. I'm always interested in seeing what you're reading, and that's a lot of what we talk about. But PK, thanks again for coming on. Always great chats.
Hey, Isaac, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening. Hope you enjoyed. And please share and reach out to PK if you need. Thanks again for joining us. This podcast was hosted by me, Isaac Matzner. It was produced by Amanda Villela and edited by Veronica Medina. You can find more episodes on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as on our Substack page. We love feedback, so please feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email at Brazil4beginners@gmail.com.